You're all very welcome. Thank you for coming to Parliament Buildings to the Commission's annual statement. The running order for today is quite simple. I'm just going to open and do a few bits and pieces of housekeeping, and then we're going to hand over to Alison, the Chief Commissioner, to say a few words before welcoming our guest keynote speaker, Baroness Shami Chakrabarti. So the boring bit first. Just housekeeping from the assembly team. So toilets, for those who don't know already, are located on this floor. You go through the door, turn left, continue down the corridor, and you'll see them signposted on the right-hand side. Smoking is not permitted in Parliament buildings at all. There's no planned evacuation drill today, so if the alarm sounds, you must evacuate the building. And please follow the direction of the Assembly ushers and the team from the Commission who will direct you out of the building. And please leave the building immediately by the nearest route. There will be doors to the right and down the stairs as you leave the hall. Please do not use the lifts in the event of a fire alarm. And please walk around to the front of the building, down the front steps to the assembly points which are on the front lawns. Once outside, do not leave the assembly point or re-enter the building until you're advised to do so. If you are in need of assistance to evacuate, please wait outside the room. A member of staff will bring you downstairs to a place of safety in the upper car park. This will be the emergency evacuation lift, or if the lift isn't accessible, an evacuation chair will be used. As for the event today, so the Wi-Fi network is NI_open, and the password is N, I, assembly. Social media, if you're posting on social media about today's event, please use the hashtag AS2024, so hashtag AS2024, and it's on the graphic and the projector screen, I hope. No, it's not. It should be. Well, there it is anyway. You may have already received a copy of the annual statement on arrival. If you haven't, they're available, should still be some available out the front door. More than one person has made a comment on how it's increasingly useful as a doorstop, as well as something very useful to read. Or you can scan the QR codes that are dotted throughout the room and on the screen. It's also available on the Commission's website, so www.nihrc.org. Just go to the publications section and you'll see the document that should be there now. This event is also being live streamed and it'll be shared afterwards in case you want to watch it back or share it with colleagues. Please feel free to do so. And then finally, we have a very short survey for the event and would really appreciate if you could take some time to fill that out at the end of the event. Without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Chief Commissioner, Alison Kilpatrick. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. It's a real thrill. Every year, I feel as proud as ever that so many people turn up for human rights and to receive our annual offering. There's a number of people watching online, so thank you to you also. You missed the refreshments. That's the penalty for not being with us in person, but we're very pleased to have you join us. So I'm going to start by saying that I will be repeating myself again. To those of you who've heard from the Commission in the last 2 or 3 years, some of this is going to seem repetitive. But in my defence, the Commission's central message and the entry point into this annual statement and human rights generally is one that cannot be overstated. Human rights and their intricate weaving into law, policy, and practice is what enabled Northern Ireland to move out of conflict, but also to sustain its people ever since. And if people feel undernourished or underprotected, it's because human rights have not been enacted or embraced as intended. And I have to be honest, they are overlooked in many quarters. They even remain contentious to some and are downright divisive for others. But in our view, this is because they are still misunderstood or misused by people who wish to divide us. We see swathes of populism and nationalism sweeping across the world. Human rights are the enemy of populists and nationalists because they unite us and give us hope. Populism thrives on the back of division and despair. And while that remains the case, then those of us who are charged with protecting and promoting human rights have to work even harder and repeat ourselves for as long as it takes. We must put the challenge to those who have the power and the means to rectify the situation, and that's essentially what the Human Rights Commission was set up to do. And I do believe in Northern Ireland we are both inspirational for others, but we are also a cautionary tale. We are both the recipient of historical scholarship on human rights, deriving from our own pain and horror at home, but also what we've witnessed abroad. And we are the author of contemporary scholarship that will better protect us all in the future. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement provided for Northern Ireland, underpinned by strict adherence to the European Convention, enforceable in our own courts, and it was incorporated directly into Northern Ireland law. It wasn't to look good or clever, but it was because it was the single most effective way to achieve the Northern Ireland we all wanted, and almost all of us voted for. The central promise in that agreement was that things would be put in place to guarantee true equality, to make civil rights and freedoms have special significance in Northern Ireland, for human rights to run through everything from that point onwards, together with transparency and accountability structures that would keep us on track and keep us honest, have everyone honouring their commitments. And when you do go back to the agreement, you can see that human rights and standards were intended to penetrate further than before. They were to reach into every aspect of society and make a tangible difference for everyone. It was never going to be a quick fix, but it was always going to be the surest way to what we thought we wanted then, and it remains that. If only we let it breathe, we knew we could enjoy rights as never before. We didn't believe we were getting a utopia. It wasn't a fairy tale, but a society in which everyone, including the poor, disadvantaged, disabled, disenfranchised, and undervalued, would have an equal opportunity at life. And those who are as old as I am will remember that policing got particular attention, and the signal message we got was that previous practices that were not human rights compliant had to be eradicated, and that no one within the service or any other agency was to be immune from facing their human rights responsibilities. And I saw that work very well in policing. What seemed to change, and I think this is key to everything, what changed particularly was the internal narrative, that it doesn't matter whether you're likely to get caught out and taken to court, human rights compliance brings its own rewards. It secured for the police, certainly, an enhanced level of professionalism. It strengthened the legitimacy of policing and was, according to a number of chief constables, the single most important thing they did to prevent and combat crime. And policing reform is certainly to be one part of it, perhaps the most immediate following Good Friday. But Northern Ireland's reform wasn't meant to start and end with the police. The Human Rights Act and the Northern Ireland Act extend to all public bodies, including private bodies exercising public functions. Each has to be proactive. It is not enough to simply avoid violations. And I could reel off a number of court judgments, legal and policy developments and practical changes that have since been brought about. But we still have people saying that human rights have done nothing for them. In some conversations I've had, it becomes clear that human rights have actually done something for them. They just didn't realise it, or they were told differently. But there are, I think, staying with the honesty theme, people who genuinely feel bereft of protection. And that suggests to us that attempts to promote a positive human rights culture in Northern Ireland haven't yet been successful. The Commission, as has been found by independent reviewers, was desperately underfunded, and our ability to educate and promote was undermined. So although my colleagues at the Commission have managed to do an awful lot with very little, we still have a lot more to do. But we have found the work with children and young people in the promotion and education side particularly enriching. And it's so nice to see representatives from the Youth Assembly here. You're very welcome. What we find is that young people don't need to be told twice. They feel this in their bones. They're still optimistic that the older people, and we know who we are, will be true to their word and deliver a human rights-based society in which everyone is equal and can enjoy their lives, not simply survive. We have a very successful schools programme, and we have a forum considering human rights in sport, and we have human rights and business. So we are trying to get to the heart of society. But as I say, we do need to do more. There is very powerful opposition to human rights out there, and we need to continue to counter it. But we do know there's an appetite. So these events, for example, and seeing so many people turn up and so many registered online, it's really heartening. So we know there's the appetite, and we're hopeful that if our financial situation is improved, hint, hint, we'll be able to meet some more of that demand. But for another year, I do have to report the counter-narrative is strong, pervasive, and gathering steam. There are people, not limited to politics and the media, but certainly very present there, who seem to sneer at attempts to build a human rights culture. And the shorthand insult that we're too woke, we've lost all sense of proportion and common sense, is thrown around too freely. Those of us who are too woke, or even just a little bit woke, are seen as weak or politically motivated. And that can take hold very quickly and forcefully because it speaks to people when they feel vulnerable. We have increasingly high levels of poverty, deprivation, otherness that can be exploited or at least can rob people of hope. Another factor that operates against the universal appreciation of human rights is that we can, and ourselves included, become expert at the language of rights, speaking it fluently, switching it on and off, but not embracing what it really means. And that can be very damaging because it leads, understandably, to people thinking that human rights don't make a practical difference. How many references do we get? I noticed 6 this morning, just in 2 newspapers, to woke people, woke police, particularly are getting attention. To the media exposing right-on nonsense and getting angry because somebody, in quotes, bad, got something reserved for good people, also in inverted commas, and who knows who decides who's good and bad in any of those scenarios. The other arguments that I noticed this morning fall into the umbrella of too many rights and not enough responsibilities. And the effect of that sort of narrative is not trivial, it is seismic. But it's often, that sort of argument is usually directed by the powerful members of the public, rarely back to government and public bodies who, it seems to me, have most of the rights to legislate, to tax, to investigate, to imprison, to use physical force, to decide where the money goes, to decide who gets treated and how, to decide who gets educated and how. A proper application of human rights does not and will not pitch public against the state in that way. A proper application means that if improper behaviour is exposed, that is seen as being with government, not against it. Governance in compliance with human rights must be government's top priority. That is, if government is committed to the rule of law in which human rights is an integral part. We must all recognise the whole point of human rights standards is to impose upon the state freestanding responsibilities. History has proved that's the best way to prevent a breakdown in society and the denigration of minorities, which surely is what we all want. I doubt we'd find somebody in this room who would argue against, but the reality of that and the practice of that is sometimes more difficult. A necessary component of the rule of law is that government and public bodies have to try and get it right. Individuals should not be left to litigate violations suffered by them. Most will not have the time, resources, and emotional strength required to take a case to court, and they shouldn't have to. Why should they? Not if we're talking about fundamental human rights. The spirit and letter of the rule of law means the state does not get to do whatever it wants unless and until a court stops it. That's not what the Good Friday Agreement was about, that's not what the Human Rights Act requires, and it's not what was protected more recently by the Windsor Framework Article 2. And if I can summarise this year's annual statement into a single recommendation, it would be that the state and all its arms must approach its policy and lawmaking from the starting point that its primary obligation is to protect and fulfil human rights, and to do so regardless of political expediency, regardless of how likely they are to get caught out and or taken to court. And that must include the treaty commitment to comply with Article 2 Windsor Framework. That is the democratic will of society. Human rights, as with democracy, is about attaching value to each and every person, even if, in fact, particularly if, they do not form part of the majority. If government elected democratically does not protect carefully the isolated and vulnerable, then one's entitled to ask, what is it for? This should never be the will of the strong over the weak. It is the protection of the weak, regardless of their lack of strength. And it is the state who must protect rights when we can't or don't know how to. Human rights law permits states to operate with a degree of freedom or legitimate policy aims, honestly pursued, to fit the needs and wants of its own people, so long as, and this is critical, so long as there's no unjustified restriction in the enjoyment of fundamental rights. And human rights are actually an awful lot more forgiving than many people think. With all that was at stake during the peace process and the negotiations for the Good Friday Agreement, no one succeeded, at least, in arguing that strict adherence to human rights would make things too difficult, or that a human rights framework would take too long or cost too much. And that was in the teeth of a brutal conflict. If ever there was a time to justify a departure from human rights to get things done, that was it, surely. But instead, human rights were seen as the way to get things done. Compromises were reached, but in line with human rights and the rule of law. There was no constructive ambiguity in the elements of the agreement that concerned human rights, and there was no time limit on it. The Human Rights Commission occupies a space between the state and the courts, in that we must keep under review the adequacy and effectiveness of law and practice relating to the protection of human rights in Northern Ireland. We investigate, we give advice, we litigate the issue if necessary. And if I may say so myself, we have done all those things this year, and I believe we've done them successfully. We have stemmed government's worst instincts and at least protected the people of Northern Ireland from laws that were egregious. We have been noticed on the international stage for doing so, with other commissions deriving support from our work. And just going back to litigation, so important is the ability to litigate in our own name that when the legislative power was found to be imprecise, I'm sure some of you in the room remember that awful day, the legislation was amended to make sure that didn't happen again. We continue, however, to face challenges from opponents, arguing without an actual victim, we have no standing. That is disturbing, particularly when deployed by the state that legislated for it in the first place. It is absolutely critical that the Commission has standing to bring a case without a victim, because only then will we be able to do what we were set up to do and what the people who voted for the Belfast Agreement were promised. We have the power to check government when no one else can or dares risk doing so. We often identify and advocate for people or issues that might be unpopular, but which raise human rights concerns. And we must be able to litigate when we see fit, without having to ask victims to put themselves forward. That goes to the heart of our effectiveness and independence. And as you'll see, I hope, from this statement, Northern Ireland has been the beneficiary of a strong human rights framework that truly has held the state and public authorities to account. But it is fragile, it does not yet reach all the most vulnerable, and it's not valued by everyone in power. Some violations are still tolerated when others are not. And you will see both the historical and the contemporary relevance of human rights being tested. We see it, it seems to me, in the background to, for example, the debate of the Legacy Act and in the Illegal Migration Act. We see it in the toleration of racism and violence against women and girls. We see it when paramilitaries are preferred over others and when intelligence or information is preferred over justice. Human rights are the only vehicle to protect all people, but only if we actually start by applying them equally and having the courage of our convictions. This annual statement also makes the point that human rights are not just about violations. Oversight is not just about policing those violations, it is about enabling and fulfilling. And when that approach truly is applied to everything, to the economy, to provision of services, we can see the effects of poverty and marginalisation diminish. When the Human Rights Act was being introduced, the Prime Minister said, human rights are in the small things, not just for individuals' enjoyment, but for the health of society as a whole. And he went on, the incorporation of the European Convention will establish a floor, not a ceiling, for human rights. Parliament will remain free to enhance these rights. So to anyone who thinks human rights have gone too far, that those advocating for a Bill of Rights or for the application of the Windsor Framework Article 2 are pushing beyond what was intended, I'd say remember this is only ever supposed to be the floor, not the ceiling. We were to debate how rights could be extended, not whether they should be. The Commission is obliged to advise on what steps are required to improve human rights protection in Northern Ireland, so we must reach a view on particular issues. We cannot wait for someone else to tell us the answer. And I mention that simply because I recently met quite a strong challenge that we had no right to pronounce unlawfulness, that only a court could ever do so. Now, technically, that's absolutely correct. We cannot decide on legality. We cannot make binding decisions, but we do not have the luxury of waiting for somebody else to tell us. That would be avoiding our duty. We must make those pronouncements. We might, of course, be proven wrong at some point in the future, but we cannot sit back and wait for others to decide for us. That's why the Commission needs courage, independence, and support from our partners and civil society. It can be a lonely place, being a naysayer, but it is necessary. Human rights and the rule of law transcend lawmakers, extend beyond borders, and apply to visitors as well as citizens. And that's central to understanding the human rights framework. The Universal Declaration and everything that followed was informed by survivors of and witnesses to the awful consequences of unequal treatment. That declaration was not sentimental. Its drafters were not naive. They were hard-nosed realists who made plain that disregard and contempt for human rights resulted in barbarous acts which outraged the conscience of mankind. And let me finish with this. Please do read the statement. The industry and expertise that went into it are exceptional, and I have my colleagues at the Commission to thank for that, all of them, including my fellow commissioners. If ever persuaded that human rights can be limited for a time or for a certain group, think back to what we had before. The denigration of the rights of few becomes the denigration of society as a whole. Human rights do come under attack frequently. If they are to survive, we have to remember and remind others what they have done for us and what might be done to us without them. I think this statement demonstrates that. I can't do justice to it in any other way, but we'll leave time. I hope you've got some interesting questions for us. Before we go to questions, however, I have the very great privilege of introducing Baroness Shami Chakrabarti. I insisted on going first because I was not going to follow her. Nobody can do that. I've learnt that to my cost. Shami's whole career has been devoted to the protection and promotion of human rights. I don't think there can be anything better said about a person than that, and that is despite it sometimes being at personal cost. Her latest contribution is a book full of warnings but also hope, and I will let her speak for herself. Shami, you're very welcome to Belfast. Thank you so much for being with us. And if I can ask you to come up and share your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Alison. That's really being set up to fail, isn't it? But seriously, I cannot think of a better or sunnier place to celebrate International Human Rights Day. And of course, we know that tomorrow marks the adoption of the Universal Declaration in 1948. But I always think that its proximity to the birthday of the world's most famous child refugee is equally poignant. It's a daunting privilege to be here as a guest of a Human Rights Commission that has so stood out in its moral leadership, even amongst other public and civil society bodies in the UK and Europe in recent years. Alison Kilpatrick has been an outstanding Chief Commissioner, in my view. And Alison and David and their colleagues have been such a powerful voice for fundamental rights and freedoms. Now, I first came to Stormont as a young government lawyer in the late 1990s. The 1990s, I'm saying that to the Youth Assembly, not the 1890s, the 1990s, right? I know. It remains a source of immense personal pride that I played the tiniest of advisory and drafting roles in what became the Good Friday Agreement. and the visionary statecraft from all parties to that historic document is something that I think the world could do with much more of today. Historic leadership and courage were shown at every conceivable level, from previously polarised local Northern Ireland communities and political parties and other brokers elsewhere in the UK, in the Republic of Ireland, the EU and the United States. Of course, many of those involved are no longer with us. But what better legacy than a working democratic assembly and administration led by two women? I was last here in Belfast in June as a guest of my friend Margaret Ritchie and the world-renowned Queen's University to promote my book, as Alison kindly mentioned, Human Rights, The Case for the Defence. Because, as she also said, the case needs to be made and remade, it would seem. And the turbulence of the times into which that book was born have only intensified in the subsequent 6 months. Around half the people on the planet live in more than 70 countries that held national polls in the largest election year in history. A recurring theme was the punishment of incumbents. But in many places, there was also a rise in far-right populism. And that highlights a contradiction at the heart of even notionally free elections. Without constant vigilance and an energetic defence of rights, freedoms, and the rule of law, democracy is capable of voting itself out of existence. Now, in numbers of eligible voters, the United States ranked third behind India and the European Parliament. However, after being the most closely watched contest, it may well prove to be the most globally significant. There is no avoiding the challenges ahead as the 45th US president becomes the 47th. Within 20 days of re-election, and just under 2 months before his scheduled inauguration, President Trump celebrated the dropping of all federal criminal charges against him. These, you may recall, related to election interference and the appropriation of classified documents after losing the 2020 race. The US Department of Justice interprets the Constitution as implicitly prohibiting any prosecution of a sitting president. And without irony, a Trump spokesperson hailed the DOJ announcement as, I quote, a major victory for the rule of law. Now, whatever one's views on Mr. Trump's politics or the substance of the indictment, it is hard, I think, to square such a blanket practical immunity going beyond immunity protection even for official acts with equality before the law. Then, of course, soon afterwards, outgoing President Biden granted his son official pardons for federal gun and tax felony convictions. His successor called this an abuse and miscarriage of justice. At the other end of unequal treatment, if Donald Trump's first term is anything to go by, a whole host of groups within and beyond the borders of the Republic may have some cause for concern. Last time, several Muslim and African countries faced US travel bans, and migrants, including children, at the US border endured a host of cruelties. Women's reproductive rights were first rolled back by international aid policy and later domestically by the overturning of Roe versus Wade in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization by a Supreme Court including 3 Trump-nominated justices. Advocates of unfettered freedom are often rather selective in its application. If nationalism, isolationism and deregulation were to exemplify US policy once more, there would be obvious consequences for conflicts in Russia and Ukraine and the Middle East in particular. It could also weaken the ability of the international community and its institutions effectively to address new technologies and the existential threat of climate emergency in the short term. In France, another permanent member of the UN Security Council, Marine Le Pen, and her Rassemblement National attracted the most votes in the European elections, standing on an anti-immigration platform and advocating a constitutional shield against European case law. As we watch events there by the hour, it may be that Notre Dame Cathedral was easier to restore than political stability. In Germany and elsewhere in the EU, far-right parties also gained ground at the expense of progressive and greener ones, with the German elections in 2025 following the collapse of Chancellor Scholz's government serving as a litmus test for the strength of that trend. Longer-term implications for wider EU policy remain to be seen. In Westminster, Labour returned to power after 14 years with explicit commitments to human rights and the rule of law. However, Reform, the successor party to UKIP and the Brexit Party, gained 14.3% of the vote and a parliamentary foothold of 5 seats. The new government's honeymoon was further dampened by days of racist violent disorder in parts of England and Northern Ireland, ostensibly targeted at asylum seekers and their lawyers. Social media played a significant role in fomenting and coordinating that violence. Elon Musk, the world's richest man, subsequently appointed to the new Trump administration, was an open instigator, posting comments that civil war is inevitable. But by contrast, tens of thousands of ordinary people participated in community cleanup operations and counter-protests in the days and months that followed. They demonstrated solidarity with those seeking refuge in our nations and undoubtedly saw off further disturbances in many towns and cities. A criminal justice system undermined by years of cuts and neglect swung into action to prioritise the disorder. 200 people were sentenced, most to imprisonment, within around 2 months of the cessation of the riots. And this was greeted with charges of two-tier policing by Reform and even some mainstream British Conservative voices. I believe that accelerated due process may be necessary to restoring law and order in such circumstances. However, necessary is not sufficient. If the rule of law is to endure, people tempted astray by alienation, inequality, misinformation, and far-right manipulation need to see law that protects and doesn't just prosecute them. They need to own, understand, and be able to access their rights in practice, whether against neglectful public services and governments of whatever level or stripe, or unscrupulous landlords, employers, and retail corporations. The decades-old Post Office Horizon IT scandal is a case in point. It finally got something of the political and media attention it deserved, thanks to the television drama Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. You'll recall that in the years between 1999 and 2015, the Post Office had pursued thousands of innocent sub-postmasters for alleged financial shortfalls that were in fact caused by faults in the Horizon accounting software developed by the Japanese multinational corporation Fujitsu. They were small, often family-run businesses serving their local communities, but under extremely onerous contracts with the state-owned post office company. A combination of Byzantine and unaccountable governance arrangements and blind trust in the infallibility of the software allowed post office executives and lawyers to bring abusive civil claims and criminal prosecutions against the sub-postmasters for theft, fraud, and false accounting. 900 were convicted, and others were forced to cover supposed shortfalls from their own savings. The loss of homes, businesses, and freedom followed, alongside bankruptcies, family breakdowns, and at least 4 suicides in one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in modern United Kingdom history. After dogged campaigning by Mr. Bates and others, alongside expensive and often soul-destroying litigation, convictions began to be quashed in court, making those affected and others eligible for compensation. And in May of this year, parliaments in London and Edinburgh legislated to overturn convictions en masse. Again, this innovation proved controversial amidst fears of a constitutional precedent of parliaments intervening in particular criminal cases and the consequent danger of politicisation and the corruption of legal process. And whilst I understand that concern, I find it unfounded. Firstly, in contrast with, say, the infamous Safety of Rwanda Act 2024, which legislated to overturn a Supreme Court finding of fact that Rwanda was not safe for asylum seekers, the Post Office Horizon System Offences Act 2024 and its Scottish counterpart responded in keeping with senior judicial findings about wrongful convictions. Secondly, and again in contrast with the Rwanda scheme, the new law worked in favour of vulnerable individuals and not against them. If, as some argued, it brought the possibility of a small, unquantifiable number of safe convictions being quashed, that was little more than a restoration of the presumption of innocence that had been displaced by a presumption of computer reliability. Thirdly, criminal pardons, as opposed to immunities, are well established in rule of law-based systems. Parliamentary authorisation is arguably far more legitimate than executive fiat. In any event, it is to be hoped that this scandal will be remembered whenever we are sold inscrutable and unaccountable technological systems likely to impact upon our liberties and our lives. In the context of artificial intelligence regulation, the EU and US chose markedly different paths even before President Trump's re-election. The EU AI Act came into force in August 2024. It takes an active regulatory approach to the technology based on varying levels of risk, thus establishing the EU as a global leader in the field. By contrast, the Biden administration opted for an industry-led approach with its executive order on the safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence, relying on voluntary standards and collaboration with the private sector. It resembles a statement of principle and international intent rather than hard-edged regulation. This may be unsurprising given the wealth and influence of Silicon Valley. Trump's appointment of a tech billionaire to the new Department of Government Efficiency, with its cost, regulation and bureaucracy-cutting mission, as well as long-standing support from modern tech plutocrats, will no doubt have implications for future AI policy. China's increasing prominence in AI and advanced chip technologies may also enhance tensions between superpowers, in an increasingly multipolar world. At the interface between war and law, developments in Israel and Palestine have been particularly tragic since the Hamas atrocity and mass hostage-taking of October 2023, and Israel's indiscriminate and catastrophic response in Gaza. In December, South Africa brought a claim of genocide against Israel before the International Court of Justice. This was supported by over 30 other states and international organisations, mostly in the Global South. Supporters also include Permanent Security Council member and human rights sceptical China, and Ireland, Slovenia, Spain, and Turkey within the Council of Europe. Now, the ongoing case prompted the court to order protective interim measures, requiring Israel to prevent acts contrary to the 1948 Genocide Convention. Later, it added an order to ensure basic food supplies to Palestinians in Gaza facing famine and starvation. It also expressed concern for the Israeli hostages still being held in the Gaza Strip. It did not order the end of Israel's military campaign. And perhaps even more dramatically, on the 21st of November last month, the ICJ issued arrest warrants against Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, alongside Hamas military commander Mohammed Deif. The judges found reasonable grounds for believing that these men bore criminal responsibility for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity in the Israel-Hamas conflict. International controversy around these warrants revived many of the fundamental arguments about universality versus sovereignty with which human rights defenders the world over are far too familiar. The US and Israeli governments' vociferous rejections of the warrants appear to be based upon Israel, like the US, not being a party to the Rome Statute. However, the occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem and Gaza were ruled to be within ICC jurisdiction in 2021. Another common refrain refers to there being no moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas. However, moral equivalence with other alleged perpetrators of crimes has never been an ingredient in criminal responsibility. Were it the case, political actors all over the world might be rendered effectively immune from this personal accountability. And if I may say so, all communities in Northern Ireland would have welcomed, rather than roundly rejecting, the Northern Ireland Troubles, Legacy and Reconciliation Act. Seems to me that the degree of consensus against that legislation may be testament to a deep-seated human desire for equal treatment and justice, rather than impunity. How the leaders of 124 state parties, including the UK and various EU members, respond to the ICC warrants in the event of prospective visits by Messrs Netanyahu and Gallant is an important test for international law, particularly if states' responses diverge with those to President Putin's arrest warrant last year. Just as important, perhaps, will be the response of popular opinion within Israel and across the democratic world. Finally, the COP29 may have been a triumph of hope over resolution. It began with the host nation, Azerbaijan, accused of oppressing political opponents, and its president describing fossil fuels as a gift of God. It ended with a $300 billion finance commitment from developed to developing countries by 2035. Of course, NGOs and poorer countries agree that this figure falls considerably short of that required to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And richer countries, perhaps understandably, complain that economies such as China and Saudi Arabia are still categorized as developing and therefore not required to provide finance. Nonetheless, some close observers described new alliances between EU and small island states. And so the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Climate Change lives on, alongside ambitions for new emissions targets to be agreed in 2025 at the COP30 in Brazil. I believe that all these international developments add greater urgency to the argument that a rights and rules-based approach might still shape common values, language, and cause on our troubled planet. I also believe that in the no doubt difficult years to come, Northern Ireland will be more and more a human rights and peace-building beacon for the wider world. Now, what's the evidence behind such a bold assertion? The clues lie both in history and in the comprehensive contemporary statement being launched by your Human Rights Commission today. The 1998 agreement and everything that led up to it framed peace in no small part around a respect for rights, freedoms, and human dignity for everyone in the territory. In hindsight, it also, if only inadvertently, rendered Northern Ireland a vital cultural, political, and economic bridge between the UK and both the European Union and the United States of America. It seems to me that such a bridge has rarely been more important than now, a quarter of a century later. And whilst strong cultural traditions and multiple identities are understood here in Northern Ireland as much as anywhere, the word everyone is not limited by place of birth. So imagine my pride after failing to persuade a Westminster Parliament of the dehumanising dangers of the well-named, if badly conceived, illegal Migration Act, that it was friends here in Northern Ireland who ultimately protected refugees, the most vulnerable people of all. So I wish you a happy Human Rights Day tomorrow, and many, many happier ones still to come. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Shami and Alison. So over to you now. Shami and Alison are both available for questions. So it's always difficult to get the first question. So hopefully someone will put their hand up. There's one already, and there's roving mics. So we'll try taking one at a time, and then if needs be, I'll take a few together.
Hi, my name's Richard Williams from the PSNI. Just a couple of things I'd just like your views on in respect to what you said. You talked about, made sort of pejorative reference to the election of far-right governments in various countries. I mean, there's Marie Le Pen in France, Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, and in Romania, the elections were recently cancelled because the candidate was far-right. And in Hungary as well, we have Viktor Orban. Is election something we actually believe in, or is it something that if we don't elect the right person, we don't actually, we take issue with it? And just related to that, you talked also about a rules-based approach. And I'd just like to ask you, who sets those rules, as opposed to maybe international humanitarian law?
application, you're quite right. So I did pejoratively refer to far-right parties in the ascendancy. And so it is important that perhaps I unpack that a little more. It was deliberately pejorative. And by the way, far right doesn't mean somebody who doesn't agree with me or someone who takes a different position to my own on, say, tax and spend. The classic way that we define who is a bit more on the left and who is a bit more on the right tends to be, rule of thumb, how much you would intervene in economic matters and tax and spend and so on. So what is my sort of definition? What makes me reach for that pejorative adjective far right? For me, that is somebody who comes from that side of politics, comes from that side of maybe the tax and spend side, but doesn't believe in fundamental rights and freedoms and the rule of law. That's what makes you a populist. Whether you're a populist of the left or right, for me, this word populism is used and bandied about. What it means for me is you do not believe in the rule of law. You would lock up your opponents and you would, give contracts to your mates. You don't believe in the rule of law and in particular equal treatment, and there's often a racist element as well, an uber nationalist racist element. That would be my pejorative definition of far right. So do I believe in elections, or do I only believe in elections when I like the outcomes? I kind of refer to what I said earlier. Yes, of course I believe in elections, and human rights and the rule of law are not in any way a substitute for elections. They in fact protect elections. Because, as I say, democracy can, if it's not careful, vote itself out of existence, because with a free election, you elect someone with a massive majority, and then they decide there's no need for any more elections. And they can start by, censoring the press, locking up their political opponents, and then they start postponing the elections and declaring longer and longer states of emergency. This has happened in previous democratic states, even in my lifetime and yours. And that's why human rights are not about trumping elections, if you pardon the pun. They are about, yes, they're about human dignity and all of that kind of inspirational personhood stuff, but they also are the ultimate regulatory mechanism for making sure that democracy itself survives.
If I could just add a very short comment to that. What we've seen in the last number of years is misinformation and disinformation the way we never saw before, or at least didn't have the reach it has now. So you're countering, in an election, you're having to counter information and miseducation that's for the electorate. We're seeing fewer and fewer people turning up to vote as well. So there may be some tweaks needed to encourage people perhaps to vote and to counter some of the disinformation, but that doesn't mean democracy itself has failed. And of course, democracy is not about numbers. Because a majority votes for something doesn't mean the majority gets its will. The rule of law means that the minority is protected despite the majority having voted for something. So that's proper democracy, where every single person, including the weak, is valued equally.
Much what you said, but isn't the solution then to embed human rights, at the very base of, of all our democracies, and it's something that's the bedrock of society. So no matter who is elected, then they have to comply with those human rights, that human rights law that that is embedded in society. I mean, it's right.
Sorry, I'm sorry to cut you short, but I'm conscious there are other people. I would just say, yes, of course, we agree with you about embedding human rights, but not just in the legal system. They also need to be embedded in the political system, in our sense of ethics and morals in communities. In Eleanor Roosevelt, they begin in small places close to home, as well as in the cabinet room, in the war room, and the interrogation room.
Thank you. We have another question over here, I think.
My question is for Alison. Hi, Alison. At the last annual Human Rights Statement launch, I asked you if you had read the Lucy Michael report on inequalities. faced by black and ethnic minorities in Belfast. The reason why I had asked you that question was to try and bring into focus the various human rights abuses on people of ethnic minority extraction here in Northern Ireland. You hadn't read the report when I spoke to you then, and there have obviously since that time been quite a lot of incidents bringing into focus the issues that we were trying to discuss that day. So my question is, have you read the report? And in the wake of what happened in August and throughout the year since that report was given, what are the thoughts of the Human Rights Commission of Northern Ireland with regards to addressing those issues?
Yes, thank you. And I believe what I said was I hadn't read it in detail, but that I had the report and I'd skim-read it. So I certainly have read it in detail now. Everything the Commission has done this year has had an eye to equalising treatment for whatever reason a person's treatment has been unequal. So we look at it, and particularly in relation to race and national origin. We've been looking at that. That's why we invested so much of our time and our resources into the Illegal Migration Act challenge, just by way of an example. There is also the Equality Commission, of course, which has the mandate for equality provisions in Northern Ireland. We look at it as anti-discrimination, so that doesn't get us off the hook, but we certainly look at everything in Northern Ireland from the perspective of anti-discrimination. Now, that doesn't mean that we have prevented inequality. I wish we could. I wish I could tell you we could. We haven't. But we're certainly doing our best and we're trying. So in the consultation exercises we have in the roundtables, etc., please do alert us to the things you think we're not covering or we haven't responded properly to.
Take another question. Just in front here.
Hi, my name's Mia Murray and I'm from the Northern Ireland Youth Assembly. Apologies. My question is directed to you, Alison. Do you feel that the human rights assurances that were set out in the Good Friday Agreement over 25 years ago have been and continue to be executed within Northern Ireland to their fullest ability?
The answer to that is no, not to their fullest ability, clearly. However, it's still the best means we have to ensure a truly equal society in Northern Ireland, which is that adheres to the human rights set out in the European Convention. So there's always more we can do. And the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the Human Rights Act and the Northern Ireland Act continue to come under assault from various sections. So we're constantly moving forward and moving back, moving forward, moving back. So we just have to keep going. We have to believe in it. It worked for a period of time. If it's ebbing and flowing, well, that's maybe natural, but it serves a purpose and it still serves a purpose, and I think we just have to cherish it. And as corny as that might sound, we have to cherish what we have. And sometimes hearing other people around the world look in at what we've done here and what we have here is the answer to your question, because they envy it. They really do envy it. So if we let it go, it's at our own peril.
The front here, and then one at the very back.
Okay. Hi, Helen Flynn from Just Fair. Just a question on the Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. So I notice it's amber in the statement and great explanation as to why it's amber. But we have a new Labour government in the UK. However, I was quite disappointed to note that in their response to the list of issues for SESCR, the new Labour government was taking the old Tory government line that there still isn't the agreement within the Northern Ireland Assembly that was never a requirement of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So I'm just wondering if either of you see routes forward, either within the Northern Ireland Executive or with a new UK government, as to actually delivering on the Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland.
I'll have the first go. The commitment was to ask the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission to advise on a Bill of Rights. which it did in 2007, 2008, a long time ago. There wasn't a commitment to implement a Bill of Rights technically, so that's a correct statement. There will be continued, I hope, focus on whether or not the contents of a Bill of Rights can be agreed, because clearly it was agreed that there was something necessary for Northern Ireland. But in the absence of a Bill of Rights, and we continue to advocate for a Bill of Rights, but in the absence of it, we do still have essentially a Bill of Rights. We have the Human Rights Act and the Human Rights Commission, which is very carefully trying to make sure that all the public authorities here are complying with the Human Rights Act. So it's a question of the additional, what was additionally required for Northern Ireland. The longer we get away from Belfast Good Friday Agreement, maybe there's more space for looking at what we do about a Bill of Rights. I don't know. There's a degree of politics to that. I don't know whether Shami wants to be put on the spot or not in relation to that.
I'm happy to be put on the spot. Whether it was a technical requirement or not for there to be a degree of consensus about the need for and the content of a Northern Ireland specific Bill of Rights, I think it would be politically nuts for any UK government to try and impose one on Northern Ireland. Just nuts. To be honest, in Westminster, notwithstanding this large Labour majority, let's remember what I said about reform breathing down the neck, and so many people are now anti-ECHR. The real Brexit is now being portrayed as leaving the Council of Europe and pulling out of the ECHR. So, and even if that weren't the case in Westminster politics, even if that weren't the case, you can't impose. It's very difficult to impose extra human rights on any people. So, if this is to come, it has to be built. It has to be hard won and built by argument and demonstration here in Northern Ireland. I think the potential comes from the work that you're already doing, that we talked about, and the fact that you do have tools that we don't even have. For example, to tackle the Illegal Migration Act, that we just didn't, we didn't even have those litigation and other tools. I think that this could be ripe territory for that kind of consensus building in the future. But we start with where we are, using the existing frameworks and tools, and then over time you build the case for further Northern Ireland specific additions to, but please, from my perspective, as I don't live in Northern Ireland, please don't make an argument for pulling out of the Human Rights Act or the ECHR, because that would leave us all in a worse position.
Thank you. Right to the back, Paula.
Paula Bradshaw, I chair the Committee for the Executive Office here at Stormont, and thank you very much for our annual reminder of how far we are behind in terms of bringing forward legislation and regulations for human rights. And my question is primarily for Shami then, in regards to an inquiry we're leading at the minute into gaps in equality legislation, and the direction of travel seems to be pointing towards a single equality bill here for Northern Ireland. And I'm just wondering if you could make a comment on how you feel that individuals' lives were better protected and supported when you saw the introduction of that in England and Wales. Thank you.
Are people better protected in it? Well, look, I'm sure that we can, we can find gaps and so on. But again, one has to build the political consensus. That's the reality. That's the hard yards. And show the examples, make the case, do it across the political spectrum. Make the case and build it from the grassroots up, because equality legislation, like human rights legislation, is not popular with everyone. We need real stories, real examples, real cases, and sometimes unexpected voices. This is how you build a campaign for progress in this area. I think it's I think equality in terms of non-discrimination and equal treatment is the key to the human rights kingdom. I don't see these two things as separate at all. There are historic reasons why in this part of the world, as opposed to other parts of the world, we had equality legislation before we had human rights legislation. But there are no real effective human rights without equal treatment. And everybody loves human rights, their own. Right? Everybody loves their own human rights, and those are their friends and family and people they agree with. It's other people's that are a little bit more challenging. And so equal treatment and binding that into every aspect of life is the key to the kingdom. But again, we have to make the case in a story-based, real person-based, non-technocratic way.
Paula, it's certainly true that we have more fragmented domestic legislation, but ultimately we do have the Human Rights Act, and we now have the Windsor Framework Article 2, which I think protects us in some ways more than in England and Wales. But we do need to continue to use the Human Rights Act properly. So there's a prohibition on discrimination across all ECHR rights. But I think also in Northern Ireland we have a solid, almost visceral dislike of discrimination, which we need to be more maybe united, non-discriminatory in its application, perhaps. But so domestic provision, I think there is a point. There are gaps in it. We don't have a Single Equality Act, for example, but we do have the Human Rights Act, and let's not forget that. So anti-discrimination has to cut across everything. And in the Windsor Framework, we have the 6 equality directives, which we have to keep pace with the EU. So in some ways, you could say we're better protected here than elsewhere, albeit more fragmented.
Any other questions?
Question as well, just to make you aware. Will we do that now?
Yeah, we'll take the online.
Hello, this is an online question. I'm just trying to summarise it because it's quite long. But the question is highlighting that France has recently introduced a raft of legislation against rape and strengthened laws on domestic violence, which is also a very big problem in Northern Ireland as well as everywhere else. They also say that wouldn't it be better to guarantee that all groups who are discriminated against have equal rights, and that in Northern Ireland they've debated making misogyny a hate crime, but unlike France, women's rights have tended to be put to the sideline. So I think they're trying to highlight the focus on women's rights in other countries and sort of trying to see would the same be possible in Northern Ireland.
Probably more of a comment than a question, but it's a comment we take on board, and it's something that the Commission is very interested in, making sure that we are equipped to eradicate violence against women and girls, which is a problem here, probably worse than anywhere else in Europe. That's certainly what the statistics tell us. And it seems to be getting worse despite efforts to eradicate it. So we need to get under the skin of this and understand why it's happening, who's doing it, and how to stop it. And we're not doing that enough, so clearly we are failing.
In this space, I would just say two things. One is I'm very, very worried by this cultural, this Andrew Tate online trend that seems to be so prevalent everywhere and seems to be setting us back culturally and politically when it comes to women's rights all over the world. And the second thing I would say is that this is one of the areas where austerity has really, really hurt. I mean, we're talking in England and Wales, we talk about the effective decriminalisation of rape because because of 14 years of austerity and cuts to the criminal justice system. The Justice Department of all Whitehall departments had bigger cuts than anywhere else. And because it is just so impossible to get timely charging and prosecution. And these sorts of cases are very sensitive and complex, particularly with mobile phones and social media and all the additional burdens on making these trials effective. The weight and what women in particular have had to go through has just put too many people off coming forward. And that's why we talk about the effective decriminalisation of rape. And that is a shocking thing to say about any any modern democracy that is supposedly built on the rule of law and human rights.
May I just, there is this notion, I think, that true equality means treating everybody the same, and this is exploited by people like that. It's not, equality is not treating everyone the same. Equality is recognizing that people are different and they need different things. So you can treat men and women differently according to their needs and historical inequalities. The same way you can treat disabled people differently if they need more. We wouldn't ever argue that a disabled person wouldn't need wheelchair access to bring them up to an equal level. So we have to keep remembering equality is not treating everybody the same. In fact, that ingrains discrimination between people, but it's superficially quite attractive. It sounds quite good. So when people like Andrew Tate say it, others may go, he's got a point, hasn't he? Why should women get all the protection? Well, women get certain protection because women are more likely to be subject to violence. But men are more likely to be subject to other sorts of violence, and they will tend to get more protection there.
Hello, my name is Addison. I'm a member of the Royal Irish Youth Assembly. This question is for both of you. Do you believe our government, both Westminster and Stormont respectively, will do what it takes to protect the increasingly precarious place LGBT rights has at the moment?
Okay, I'm not going to tell you what I think the government is going to do. That's far too political. My brain isn't quite up to that assessment. What I can tell you is what's happened so far, and that is that there are rights that have not been promoted, fulfilled, protected in the same way as others, and you quite rightly identify one of areas. So LGBTI rights, I think, certainly fall into that. We do have, again, I would say, the Human Rights Act. Let's use the tools we have and hold government to account if they don't ensure rights protection for everyone, and bring it to the Human Rights Commission and the Equality Commission if necessary. So I'm not going to predict, but I hope this new government is true to its word in that it has reset, I think is the way it's been described, its relationship with us, but also with the European Convention on Human Rights.
I would just so agree with that. And I know that we're both bigging up the Human Rights Act and the ECHR, but in this area in particular, history is on our side. You know, politicians of all stripes now, certainly in Westminster, want to say, didn't they do great things bringing forward various pieces of legislation on equal rights for queer people? But so much of that was led by Strasbourg litigation in particular. If you go back through the history, it was a very, very powerful tool. And that's Article 14 of the Convention that Alison explained at length, the equal treatment provision, in tandem with Article 8, which isn't just privacy, it's also personal autonomy and private life. And those two together have been such a powerful dynamo and continue to be. So yes, we want governments to do the right thing, but guess what? Sometimes they are feeling twitchy about the newspapers and accusations of being woke and other parties breathing down their neck. And that's one of the reasons why we do need these instruments, and we have them, and they have been particularly useful in the past in that space, and we need to keep using them.
Thank you. Another question? Yep.
Short comment on the point about sexual crime. As Alison said, for disabled people, we have ramps to give access. For sexual crime, there's an African NGO which works in an integrated way with the victims of sexual crimes, from hospital to psychiatrists to people teaching them to teaching sort of self-defense, to investigation of crime, and to ultimate prosecution of crime. So it's possible that some of these, it's called the Ponzi Foundation, first started in the Congo, in Rwanda, and it's had great success. And that's sort of perhaps looking at other ways in which specific forms of crime might need to be dealt with in order to lead to redress for the victim, but also dealing with the perpetrators.
I'm going to, Shami has a response to this as well, but before she does, if I could just remind everybody that we now have in Foyle the Family Justice Centre, which is set, it's got its doors open and it's working, and it's working beautifully. We need more statutory agencies to sign up to it, but the idea is that you have everybody there, the police, doctors, courts, everybody, so victims of sexual crime only have to tell their story once, and everybody comes together to prosecute if necessary and take whatever steps are necessary. And it's a similar kind of, I think it's a similar sort of approach. The idea is that everything is there when you need it, and nobody slips through the cracks, as it were. But it's, yeah, I've looked at that foundation. It's great, and it does work. But I think Mary Brown is in the audience. I think she's still there. Mary Brown is the brains and the brawn and everything behind the Family Justice Centre, so she's actually got it going and working now in Foyle. So I think direct more at her. Yeah, she's got her hand up, but let Shami respond.
I basically endorse everything that you've said about the need to have a multi-agency approach and be particularly sensitive to the nature of this kind of crime. And we're now making baby steps in that direction in England and Wales. But until a couple of years ago, official guidance to prosecutors was advising that women shouldn't have therapy pre-trial because those notes might be sought by the defence, and there might be arguments that they were being coached. Imagine saying to a woman who's just been through a rape that she shouldn't go to therapy because it might prejudice the case. And that was in official guidance. So the system has been so broken for a long time. But the approach that you suggest, I think, is definitely what we need.
Can I just comment just on Northern Ireland? I think one of the gaps has been from the Good Friday Agreement that there wasn't enough focus on domestic abuse and sexual abuse that happened throughout the Trouble. So the provision wasn't put in there for us to really address, nor the funding that came in didn't come towards women's groups to really address that. So what we're seeing is the aftermath now. So if we're looking to be an example to the rest of the world, could we look at putting in what we didn't do as well, so that they do it right elsewhere and not just do what we did? In terms of the Family Justice Centre, I have worked in lots of places to look at how we could put it right and how we best serve victims, and they are the best people to tell us how we work with them, and they are the best people to tell us the blocks and the barriers, because we talk about it a lot. But even in the development of the Justice Centre, it's agencies and groups and people who are employed to work for victims tend to be the blocks and the barriers, because they don't want to change what they do. Our system is currently failing victims and survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. We've also got a legacy of abusers that we didn't address or deal with. So we need to come together and we need to listen to them. And that's what the Justice Centre is based about. It's about us all together, not one agency leading. And I think that's the quality of the services. And we have young people really telling us what they need and want, because they've been the hidden victims as well.
Well, that's clearly inspirational work. And I was just thinking back to a previous question about a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. And what you've just identified is clearly an area that is ripe for development. You know, what if we were to be ambitious and say, yes, we've got the rights that we have, but where would we want to build? You've identified an area that is ripe for development, subject to all the caveats I set out before about needing to build consensus. But it's ripe for building consensus, isn't it? Because there are positive obligations to women that are being neglected, not just in Northern Ireland, but all over the world. But of course, positive human rights obligations are one of the more controversial areas for rights skeptics. But that's why we have to give them real graphic examples, like the way that states, whether in France or in the UK or in the US, or let alone in the developing world, are failing women. You have notional crimes like rape that are effectively decriminalised in very advanced countries because the positive obligation of the state to protect is being failed. So I think it's ripe territory for building new rights as well as services. And I think also the area of tech and AI is another area that is ripe for exploring whether, to go back to another question about what our rights are, who decides, that yes, I cherish all the rights we've been discussing, but it may be time for developing new rights, a right to a human decision in relation to things that are very important to you, and so on.
Thank you. Just a few minutes left of time if there are any other questions. Kevin.
Thanks very much. Kevin Hanratty from the Human Rights Consortium. Thanks very much to Alison and Shami for your wonderful presentations. Shami, I was with you up until it was political nuts to bring in a Bill of Rights via Westminster legislation. The history of this place is that over 25 plus years, Stormont has proved itself incapable of introducing human rights, so substantive human rights and equality legislation. If we were to be limited by political consensus in this place, so we couldn't get additional human rights protections if we were dependent on political consensus here, we wouldn't have equal marriage, we wouldn't have access to abortion rights, we wouldn't have the devolution of police and justice. In fact, we wouldn't have the Good Friday Agreement because the DUP didn't want to sign up to that. So I would appeal to you and to your colleagues in Westminster to have a better understanding of this place, because if we are dependent upon political consensus, that is by definition a veto on advancing human rights and equality in Northern Ireland, nothing less. I would love to be proven wrong. I would love to see the Stormont Assembly move forward, introduce new human rights and equality legislation, but it has proven itself incapable of doing that in the last 25 years. So please, we need better support at a UK government level in Westminster to advance on the Bill of Rights. I was 19 when I voted for the Good Friday Agreement. I voted for it because it contains substantive human rights and equality provisions that we've never seen. They haven't seen the light of day. So please, be a better ally and support us better than that.
Okay. So I'll try and be a better ally by obviously deferring to your greater experience. I wasn't suggesting that Westminster should not legislate for human rights in Northern Ireland. Of course I wasn't. I was just saying, if the argument now, and I think that's what we were discussing, was that there should be additional rights developed in Northern Ireland that go above and beyond, let's say, the Human Rights Act and the ECHR, go above and beyond what there is in the rest of the UK. It's very, very hard for me, as an ally, but not as a member of this community, to dictate to you what these additional Northern Ireland rights should be. I'm not saying that if there were a consensus or a movement for these new additional Northern Irish rights, if that gained currency, I'm not saying it wouldn't be legislated for in Westminster, but the actual menu, the actual detail, the actual argument has to come from here, because how can I tell you that you should develop and have rights that I prescribe for you? I don't think that's being an ally. I think that's being a bit of a conqueror, actually.
Any other questions? Otherwise, you've been a very disciplined audience and nearly brought us in on time, which is wonderful. Can I just thank everyone for the Commission in today's event? You know, each year people are turning out. It's obviously become something of a calendar event for people at this time of year, and it's wonderful that you've all taken the time to come and join us. And most of all, of course, we'd like to thank Shami for giving up her time and expertise, giving us a wonderful speech. And if you could join me in thanking Shami, and at the same time, I'd like to add, of course, to the wonderful professional human rights staff team at the Human Rights Commission for making it all possible. Thank you.